We will start with Vladimir Kara-Murza, who probably needs no introduction today because we've all heard a very nice introduction yesterday when Vladimir received the award. He's a historian by his profession, and he's also one of the most notable political activists Russian activists living abroad.
And I want to especially thank the organizers for including a panel discussion on this topic, on the topic of Russia after Putin. And Jakob Ezil, who is there, thank you for making this topic a part of this conversation, because I believe this is one of the most important topics that we not only can but have to discuss now. This has been the first topic of conversation over the past 7 months with all the heads of state and government I've had the honor of meeting since being released from prison, including with Chancellor Scholz here, also with President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, and others. And it was very important for me that they are thinking about this question too. This never came as a surprise. Often when I try to raise a subject in a public setting, such as this one, I see some sort of surprise in some people's eyes. And well, why should we be talking about Russia after Putin? Nothing. There doesn't seem to be any change. There's no sign that anything is coming. To which I always respond that, as you just said in a presentation at the beginning of this panel, I'm a historian. And the one thing we do know about the modern history of Russia is how quickly, how suddenly, and how unexpectedly major political change in our country can come. There is a very good book, which I recommend to everyone interested in Russian history. It's a book on the last years, the final years of the Soviet system, late 80s, early 90s, that was published in the University of Berkeley, California, in the United States last year. It's a book by prominent sociologist Alexei Yurchak, and I absolutely love the title of this book. It was forever until it was no more, because that's exactly how it was, as those of us old enough to remember the end of the Soviet Union can attest to. And this is how things always happen in Russia. As you can probably guess by my biography, I'm not too big a fan of Vladimir Lenin, and I'm not known for quoting his speeches too much, but there's one speech of his that I do like to quote. And this is a speech he gave to the young Social Democrats of Switzerland in the city of Zurich, which he ended that speech by saying, these are famous words, "We old folks will not live to see the decisive battles of the coming revolution." That speech was made on the 22nd of January, 1917. This is how things happen in Russia. And so it is absolutely imperative that we do think about this question of Russia after Putin. And not only think, but prepare. Because one of the biggest problems with all these previous instances of rapid and unexpected political changes in Russia is that people were simply not ready for it. Not mentally ready, not practically ready. Nobody had given it an iota of thought because, of course, the regime was supposed to be forever. It was forever until it ended. And that is why so many mistakes were made during these crucial, brief periods of opportunity, windows of opportunity for democratic change. And that's why, in my view, the chance in 1917 was squandered so badly by the provisional government, and also that's why the chance for a true democratic transition in Russia in the 1990s was squandered, in my view. In the summer of 2003, we started a sort of a discussion, I don't know if that's an appropriate term, given the circumstances, with Alexei Navalny on this very topic. He published an article from his prison in the Vladimir region in August, I believe, 2023, about what he saw as the main mistakes made in Russia in the 1990s. I responded with my article in September of 2023 on the same topic, and then there were some other people who joined in this discussion. And everybody who participated in this conversation, as it were, including Alexei, including myself, we began by pointing out that this is not just a historical reflection, although that in itself will be interesting and valuable. This is not about the past, this is about the future. Because we need to be able to learn from past mistakes to make sure that we do not repeat them again. And so the purpose of that conversation was to sort of look at all the underwater stones that were there in the 1990s and that led us to where we are today, to make sure that we do not step on them again. To my mind, there were two major mistakes made in the 1990s which led us where we are. One on the domestic side and one on the international side. hence all my conversations on this subject with the presidents and prime ministers. But starting with the domestic one, because that, of course, was the most important and the most consequential. We know, again, from history, that every country that has successfully transitioned from democracy to dictatorship, be it South Africa after apartheid, Argentina after the military junta, Central and European countries after the collapse of communism, of course Germany after 45, and then again in the eastern parts after 1989. All of those countries have undergone through this process of a public reckoning with the crimes of the past regimes, a process of public reflection. The forms and the formats were different in each country. Somewhere it was Truth Reconciliations Commissions, other places Judicial Tribunal, other places lustrations, and so on. But the two key themes were the same everywhere: transparency and accountability. It was important that society was made aware of all the horrendous crimes that had been committed in its name by these previous regimes, and it was important that people responsible for these crimes were brought to some kind of accountability. Again, different formats everywhere, but the essence remained the same. Because we know very well, again from history, that when evil is not publicly reflected upon, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it is going to come back. And this is exactly what we saw in Russia, because to me, the biggest mistake of President Boris Yeltsin in the 90s, and this was part of our discussion with Alexei Navalny, because a lot of people, sort of when they think back to the failures and mistakes of the 90s, they think back to the loans for shares, auctions, to the voucher privatization, to the corruption that was happening at the time, and so on and so forth. And of course, all the things are very bad. Nobody would argue with this. But as we know, unfortunately, corruption exists even in democratic countries. But there's not a single example where you can have democracy when you have a KGB. And so to me, the biggest mistake of President Boris Yeltsin, the biggest failure of the democratic government of Russia in the 1990s, was that they never went through that process that was undergone in other post-totalitarian countries. There was never any meaningful and full opening declassification of the archives. The old KGB archives remain classified to this day. There was never any judicial accountability for people who were committing even the most horrendous crimes. I mean, by 1991, when the Soviet regime collapsed, there were still a couple of organizers of the Katyn massacre of the Polish army in 1940 in Smolensk who were still alive. There were still people who were personally torturing political prisoners such as academician Vavilov in Stalin's time in the Soviet Union. They were still alive in 1991. Nothing happened to them. Not to mention all the crimes that have been committed since. And of course, there were no illustrations of the kind that took place in the former Czechoslovakia, in Baltic states, and some other countries whereby the people who were personally responsible for these crimes or belonged to the structures that had been committing these crimes were limited from occupying positions of authority. To be clear, and this is very important, there were people at the time, this is not something we talk about with hindsight of 3 decades, there were people at the time in Russia, in the early 90s, who were actively, loudly calling, shouting for these measures. Galina Starovoytova, a prominent member of parliament from St. Petersburg, one of the leaders of the Russian democratic movement, has twice introduced into the Russian parliament a bill on lustrations that would have limited former senior officials of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and former senior officers of the Soviet KGB from occupying positions of power. That bill was not even considered. Vladimir Bukovsky, a prominent Soviet-era dissident, long-time political prisoner, who served as an expert on the legal team of President Boris Yeltsin during the Constitutional Court case on the case of the Communist Party in 1992, went around every single office in the Kremlin and on Staraya Ploshchad, the presidential administration, knocking in every single door, talking to them about the importance of opening all of these Soviet-era and the KGB archives to make sure that all these crimes are out in the public, that people are aware of them, and that there had to be some kind of a condemnation on the state level to make sure this would never happen again. He was not listened to. All his calls fell on deaf ears. And there's one important document that I would urge everyone interested in that area and that topic to read. This was a dissenting opinion published by Russian Constitutional Court Justice Anatoly Kononov on the 30th of November 1992. It was connected to the same case, in the Constitutional Court case of the Communist Party, which was essentially a toothless decision. And Kononov wrote his own dissenting opinion in which he argued very forcefully and very, backed up by details and references to international law. He argued for holding a real judicial tribunal for all the crimes committed by the communist regime, based on existing international statutes, including statutes and conventions to which the Soviet Union itself was a party, like the Convention Against Torture, the Convention Against Genocide, all the relative provisions of the International Covenant Civic Political Rights. The USSR was actually part of these conventions, and it broke them, needless to say, violated them every single day of its existence. But that was, of course, a dissenting opinion. It did not have legal force. So there were people at the time who warned that if this was not done, there would be consequences. When Bukovsky received his final no from President Yeltsin's administration, he just shook his hand and he said to these guys, they were telling him that what he is proposing, illustrations, trials, openings of the archive, Yeltsin officials said that this amounted to a witch hunt, that he was demanding a witch hunt. And Bukovsky just shook his head and he said, okay, then in a few years' time, the witches are going to come back and they're going to start hunting us. And that, of course, is exactly what happened because, again, as we know, when evil is not publicly reflected on, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it's going to return. And so just 8 short years after the Russian Democratic Revolution in 1991, a former Soviet KGB officer, Vladimir Putin, came to power, and he started his rule very symbolically in December of 1999 by unveiling a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov on the Lubyanka building, the former site of the KGB. Andropov, of course, somebody who epitomized everything that was wrong with the Soviet system, both in terms of the domestic repression and external aggression. And very quickly on the second mistake that was more international in nature, and had also played a very negative role in eventually leading to the failure of our democratic reforms in the 90s. And that was the fact that unlike many other countries of the former Warsaw Pact, unlike other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Russia never really had that promise in the early 90s of Euro-Atlantic integration that served as such a powerful impetus, such a powerful incentive for reforms in countries such as Poland and the Czech Republic and the Baltic states. Having that light at the end of the tunnel, that promise of a return to the family of European nations, a return to the civilized world, was the most powerful incentive there could be for these countries to persevere and complete their difficult reforms in terms of all the market transformation and democratic reforms that needed to be implemented. When Václav Havel spoke to the American Congress in February of 1990, he termed the entire process of post-communist transformation in Czechoslovakia as, and I quote, our return to Europe. This was his phrase. This is how it was seen. Russia never really had that promise in the early 90s. And in fact, when President Boris Yeltsin, on the 20th of December 1991, wrote an official letter to NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner, for the first time publicly and officially raising the question of future Russian membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, he never even received a response. And a few years ago, I was writing an article about this for a Polish magazine. And I went to the archives, to the sources, to the Library of Congress in Washington, to other places, to look through the newspaper clippings, to look through the documents, the sources, to see how it was possible that something of this magnitude from the president of Russia is not even responded to. And all the sources at the end of the day went back to the same point, that Western officials and NATO leaders were so shocked by the very idea, because nobody had given it any thought, because the Soviet regime was supposed to be there forever, that they were too taken aback to offer a coherent response. This is a direct quotation from the New York Times article. The consequences of that, well, we're still living with them today. We cannot afford to repeat the same mistakes the next time there's a window of opportunity, an opening for a democratic transition in Russia. Domestically, there needs to be accountability. There needs to be transparency and accountability in relation to all the war crimes that have been and still are being committed by Putin's regime in Ukraine, in relation to crimes committed against our own people, like the assassination of opposition leader Boris Nemtsov 10 years ago, like the assassination of Alexei Navalny 1 year ago, like the persecution of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners. There will need to be transparency and there will need to be accountability so that this time we truly turn the page on the authoritarian past and never return to it. And in the international sense, in international context, I believe that Western countries need to think forward to that moment, to have a road plan for the day after Putin, so that they stand ready to help and assist Russia with its democratic transition and to help swiftly integrate that future post-Putin democratic Russia into the international rules-based system, into the Euro-Atlantic community, because this is in the interest of all of us. For as long as there's a regime in the Kremlin that tramples on the rights of its own people, that disregards its own laws and its own constitution, it is never going to respect international norms of civilized behavior. It's never going to respect the borders of its neighbors. domestic repression, external aggression in Russia always go hand in hand. It's in the interest of everybody that there's a normal, legitimately elected, democratic government in Russia that would respect its own people and that would respect international norms. And the only way, I truly believe this, that we can achieve long-term peace, security and stability on the European continent is with a democratic Russia. None of us in this room or anywhere else knows when that opportunity is going to come. But it will, because nothing is forever. Mr. Putin is not an exception. And we need to be ready for that moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you. So let's move on with our panelists. The only thing is I would really encourage you to be very brief, especially since, as I understand, two of our panelists have a plane to catch, and they would have to leave at 3 o'clock sharp. So don't hold it against them. But the next speaker is Gennady Gudkov, who's a Russian politician, and Gennady.
Yeah, thank you very much. My English is not so good as Vladimir's, but I have one advantage. I worked with Putin and met with him several times, and worked and was acquainted with Mr. Gorbachev, and of course we talked much about the situation in Russia and in the Soviet Union when he was the General Secretary of the CPSU. And to my mind, the main mistake, I will debate a little bit with Vladimir, was made in 1993. Because you remember maybe these events, I know them. I remember them very exactly. And this was the moment when the parliament was shot with by tanks. And the constitution was adopted in Russia 2 months later. It gave complete power, political power to the president. No parliamentary control, no parliamentary investigation, no coalitions in the government, the absolutely dependent court, etc., etc. And it was the question of time when a person who will be the president of Russia, decided to make it any country he wants. So complete, total power was given to the president. Boris Yeltsin didn't want to do this with Russia, and Putin, when he read this constitution, he understood that he has power much more than any monarch in Europe in the Middle Age centuries. So that is why I will speak about. Vladimir said what to be done with Russia after Putin. But this question is, so to say, causes in our political migration a little bit sarcasm, because it's very good to talk about Russia after Putin, but unfortunately Putin is in the Kremlin and we are here. We lost our country, and what if we won't defeat Putin, if we want to win this war against regime, this day will never come, maybe in 20 years. Because modern medicine and its successes can prolong Putin's life for decades. So that's why I will speak maybe about not very pleasant things, but one Russian anecdote: optimists learns English, pessimists learn Chinese, and realists learns automatic rifle Kalashnikov. Maybe I'm from the third category. That's why I will try to speak about more real things. First of all, Russian political migration, we are not so much separated as it usually people think. We have we do not have any disagreements, for example, for the main future of Russia. It's a democratic republic with coalition government, no president as a Tsar, with independent court, independent media, etc., 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 human rights. We all want this Russia, this democratic state integrated in Europe, maybe in NATO, if it will survive after Trump. There's no problem with it, of course. But what should be done? Of course, it's the dream, but this dream will never come true, as Putin is in the Kremlin. So the main thing, how we can avoid of Putin. The main thing, that is the sense to discuss future of Russia, if we have the plan, strategy, how to send Putin to the historic waste. That is the main thing. And how to do this? Because, it's very like we trying to discuss the recipe of soup from a shark, which is not caught in the sea, and no one knows who will caught whom. That is why now we are lost. We lost the country. We are in this position which force us to think of how we change Russia. We are deprived of these possibilities right now. What is happening? I would like to say that the Soviet Union was defeated in year 1991, but it was defeated by the whole world, democratic free world, which had strategy, certain plans, certain intentions, and efforts of millions of people were joined by this strategy. It was said first time in Fulton by Mr. Churchill. It was a Cold War, and this Cold War resulted in complete defeat of the communism in 1991. I will ask you a very simple question. Do democratic coalition, free world, has any strategy or plans or distinct intention what to do with Russia, what to do with Putin's regime? Unfortunately, I think, because I asked this question many times in different institutions in Europe and the United States, there is no plan, no strategy, no understanding. How can we, if we take Russian opposition, Russian political migration, Russian democratic forces, we cannot handle with Putin simultaneously ourselves. We cannot do this without a certain support of the Western world. It's impossible. I think it's the same in Iran, in Afghanistan, and in many other countries which are now under oppression. Yes, that is why. The main thing, if we want to see tomorrow of Russia, future of Russia, as a democratic and free country, we must join our efforts to decide. Western countries should decide one thing: whether they friends with Putin or they fight against this regime. It's impossible to leave this situation undetermined, unclear. And I think it's my narrative to Western politicians, to Western leaders, to Western societies. Because the world, Europe, will never have a sustainable peace, security, safety, development till the moment Putin is on the Kremlin. It will be always a danger of a new destructive war, maybe a nuclear war. And Putin now supports everything with what interferes us to live. He supports world terrorism, international terrorism. He supports all dictatorships and these regimes which threaten the civilization with different wars and conflicts. That is why. And I address to colleagues from the West to make this decision, to work out a new plan, to work out the new strategy or doctrine of containing Russia, of deterrence of Russia. If we don't do this, there's no real sense to speak about Russia after Putin, because after Putin will be Putin if we won't stop it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gennady. I think it's especially interesting to hear after we all been reading news about the conversations between the presidents. So I think it's you can see that this is a very fluid situation, and there are many questions there. So I'll give floor next to Marina Ovsyannikova, who is a Russian journalist, now political refugee. She has a personal story. They're interesting. Some of you may have heard it yesterday. And we talked briefly yesterday, and I asked Maria maybe to say a few words about the propaganda machine in Russia and the extent to which after Putin, this propaganda machine, all people who are involved would be willing, somehow transform, whether there is a real sense of kind of a passion and conviction in that particular professional milieu. Okay. Please be brief, about 5 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. I want to say propaganda usually shows all Russians support Putin, all of them united around Putin. I want to say you it's not true, because all Russians are scared now. We just saw this video from short video about Lyubov Sobol. It's Russian reality, because the same guys broke my door in the 6 a.m. in the morning, and it was the same situation, because these guys is usually coming in the morning, early in the morning. The Russian population is really scared. But I will be talking about my own opinion, about my former colleagues on Channel 1. I have to say, maybe before the war started, maybe 20 or 30% of my former colleagues from Channel 1, they really support Putin. The other 70-80%, they perfectly understand what's happened in the world. They perfectly understand the situation, because on the one side, on their wall, they have screens who are broadcast Sky News, they're watching Sky News, they're watching CNN, and they perfectly understand what kind of situation. These people, they are not support this regime. They are just playing for the Kremlin rules, because they perfectly understand they can't find another job as journalist in Russia, because if they want to work as independent journalist, they have to immigrate. They have to immigrate, and it's a very difficult decision, personal decision, to immigrate from Russia, because they have exactly all elderly parents, they have children, and they just continue to play on these Kremlin rules. They perfectly understand where is good, where is evil, but I think these people are just waiting when a situation in Russia just research some bifurcation point, and when some changes will be possible in Russia. And because these people really support European values, Western values, they get used to travel across Europe, and after the war started, they lost this opportunity to travel abroad, and I think all of them just now depressed. They really find themselves in such internal immigration, and they waiting when finally this regime start to have some problems, and I think they're ready to support some democratic forces. They really ready to support democratic values and human rights. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marina. Thanks. So now I'm glad to introduce again Mariana Yarovskaya, the filmmaker who is behind the movie of one movie, the Women of Gulag, but the other movie is about our next panelist, Lyubov Sobol. So I would suggest, Mariana, you just start and give us a kind of your remarks, and then we turn to Lyubov to hear from her. Okay.
Thank you so much. You've seen the first couple of minutes, the opening scene of the film I've been making for 2.5, 3 years. And it's mostly about hope, but it's also about courage and resilience. We start with Lyubov's arrests. She's somebody who underwent almost 20 arrests and has been on a hunger strike for a month and had to stop because of the safety of her colleague, actually, who could have died. Ended up almost losing her husband to a poisoning, lost her closest friend and ally, Alexei Navalny, because Lyubov was his first employee and closest friend and ally. And while Navalny was still in prison, he suggested that Lyubov flees because she has a small daughter and would be more useful outside of the country than inside. So she continued her fight outside, and that's what the film is actually about. I do believe one of our main consultants is probably one of the most successful dissidents that I've met outside of Russia, Sergei Guriev. He is now heading the London School of Economics. And Sergei's opinion on Putin's on Russia after Putin is very optimistic, actually. He's in the film a little bit, and he says that he doesn't believe that Putinism will exist after Putin. But I'm not an economist or a politician, so I will give floor to Luba.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And Luba, we can see you on the screen, so please, the floor is yours, and we are happy to have you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Many people are now talking about a possible peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, but I'm sure that there can be no lasting peace while Putin is in power. He wants to take full control of Ukraine, not only of Avdiivka, but on Kyiv. And the best way to guarantee Ukraine's security and Europe's security would be a deep democratization of Russia. And can Russia become a democracy in the future? I think, of course, but this only be possible after Vladimir Putin is gone. And we don't know when or how it will happen, because in dictatorships, such things are always uncertain, but no one stays in power forever, and I'm totally agree with Vladimir Kara-Murza in it. And Vladimir Putin's regime will eventually end, just like the dictatorship in Syria, for example, recently did. And right now, it's quite clear for me what needs to be done first. Besides ending the war in Ukraine and any other ways of aggression, Russia must seriously reform its security forces, which have turned into a political police and one of the main beneficiaries of corruption. All political prisoners must be released, and there should be a major amnesty for those jailed for non-violent economic crimes. And another important step is allowing opposition parties to be registered and take part in elections. And I'm sure that if these changes happen, democracy in Russia can last for a long time. Thank you.
I'm glad to see that we have another panelist, Masha Alokhina, who is very well known as a member of the Pussy Riot Collective. But we know that all members of that collective eventually went on to continue to do other things. So some maybe not, but some became municipal deputies and others became publishers. And Masha, the floor is yours. So if you could give us your vision of Russia after Putin.
For me, it's a little bit hard. I think to talk about something which does not exist now, but I don't know how many people will agree with me, but I think the main point for now to talk about any free future for Russia and for the world is saving Ukraine. Because this war is going for 3 years already, and the whole world is watching what is going on. And if Ukraine will lose the war in the front of the eyes of, the whole world, it will be a sign for this regime to continue aggression. That probably sounds banal, but there are examples that Putin is continuing to invade other countries. For example, he has Belarus with the friend dictator Lukashenko. They are changing the government in Georgia, and a lot of my friends who had to leave Russia because of the criminal cases, because of the persecution, and went to Georgia, now facing danger and have to leave Georgia already, like they left Russia. There were protests in Georgia last year, and several people been caught, beaten very brutally by police with broken bones and etc. Some of these people, for example, Russian activists, been jailed just for participation of the protests, and nobody knows it. So territories like North Kazakhstan, for example, which Putin consider probably also as Russians, and countries like Moldova potentially could be also occupied. And again, if all of this will happen in silence, it's a danger for the whole world, and there will be no free Russia and there will be no free world. So this is my opinion. This is a crazy wish to rebuild the dead body of Soviet Union with all the resources which he has. And Europe now should understand that the countries which are attacked, they should be protected by Europe. So, because United States has their own battle now. This machine of repressions is quite old. I mean, it's at least 100 years of FSB, KGB, Cheka. They are keeping this tradition, and I don't think that they are going to stop. So it's probably time for Europe to understand it, what they are facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we do have a few minutes before our panelists go. So let me start the discussion by asking a question, and I'll ask Gennady, and I would invite all panelists to contribute if they would like to. But something that, in fact, Vladimir mentioned that among the one of the issues, one of the things that didn't work after the breakup of the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, was the lack of this prospect of integration of Russia into a larger world, and European world in particular. And I want to ask everyone, the kind of deliberately provocatively, that yes, there is a good argument that there has to be a kind of a united front that would confront Russia as it is today. But is there a danger that this united front, this confrontation, will eventually freeze whatever authoritarian regime exists in Russia? And that confrontation, that military buildup and isolation of the future Russia, or the current Russia, will eventually lead to the reproduction of the same kind of a KGB-led system that we have to deal with today. So, Gennady, you as a strong supporter of the strategy, how do you see the strategy working there?
This strategy, a kind of new Cold War. I say it because we know the results of Trump-Putin's negotiations. It is a kind of Cold War, a new doctrine of containing Russia. It means that we should make certain plans how to, I will say directly, to create conditions for crash of the collapse of the Putin's regime, to create conditions to undermine this regime from inside. We cannot remove Putin from his post. It could be done only with Russians inside of the country. That means that we must find allies inside of the country. And we are not, we do not think that revolution now in the nearest future is possible because there is no conditions for this revolution now. What could be done? Some inter-elite coup d'etat, nothing more. And part of elites were very concerned. I remember very well, year 2023. A lot of representatives of Russian elites went abroad to discuss this situation, to find the way out, to have contacts. What did they receive in response? Nothing. No guarantees. No distinct answers what should be done and how Western coalition will guarantee their security and, for example, sanctions, etc. So the possibility of dialogue with Russian elites, it was lost completely in year 2023. I know this exactly. I won't speak now here in this auditory or in this room about the reasons and who made which mistakes, but we lost this possibility. And Russian elites now they have to consolidate around Putin. They have to bring their capitals back to the country. It was many tens of $billions, by the way. They strengthened Putin. And they were in the regime of standby the whole year, 2024. They were waiting for the situation. What will be the result of election campaign in the United States, etc., etc., etc. What will Europe decide to do? What will be the efforts of to support Ukraine? And now we still in this position because Trump strengthened Putin greatly. Now Putin is the very good position inside of the country. But it doesn't mean that all Russian elites are going to live with this political course. It doesn't mean. That's why if we work out some strategy, we will start this dialogue with people who completely unsatisfied with Putin's politics and with Putin's regime. That is the way to start this work. We do not think that Putin's regime will have long history if we work against it. If we won't work, of course, he can govern the country maybe 20 years more, 20 years longer, and these will be the years of very great danger. Different military conflicts, different wars, different blackmailing of the world with the nuclear potentials, etc., etc. If we won't start this work, and we won't find allies, we won't be able to provide Russia after Putin.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Vladimir? Marina, you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm absolutely agreeing with Gennady. We can. I think we have only one hope, and it's splits of Russian elites. Yeah, because don't any hope for we can't organize any crowded protests now in Russia because it's too dangerous. And we have only one way: split of elites.
Okay.
And by the way, this option is the most safe and very cheap, comparatively with all other measures.
Okay, then I have a follow-up question, which is actually not very kind of far-fetched, because we've seen kind of if not a rebellion, but we've seen some events in the summer of 23. So what if this internal process that will be underway in Russia will bring to the power someone who is not exactly anti-Putin, sort of. There will be a figure, I wouldn't say like Prigozhin-like, but you get a sense, sort of. I understand that, and Vladimir actually said it very well. There is a list of things that you have to do to close the kind of authoritarian future, but that may not be possible because the new regime would not be that different from the old regime. It will be different, though, and so my question is that is there a plan for this kind of scenario? Would something be possible? What could be done? What should be done? And you have largely continuity, but still small window of opportunity.
We understand that first task is to remove Putin from the Kremlin. Of course, it could be done only, as I said, inside of Russia. Any person who will come to power will have to communicate with the Western coalition, with Western countries, to start negotiations. And we think that we, in this case, where we awaiting a transit period, it will last, we think, we consider, about 1.5 or 2 years, not more. And during this period, part of the elites now existing and working in the country, maybe not committed, who not committed crime, bloody crimes, it should be involved in this process of reforms to prepare conditions for making a new political system, to elect new authority bodies of power. But we understand that this is, we will have, if we have this possibility, we will have this transit period. Of course, part of Russian immigration political who will want to come back to take part in it. Of course, they will take some posts in this transit government. We think it's the only possible and safe way to start to reform Russia. We do not think others. Maybe Vladimir says something.
Okay, yeah, Vladimir.
No, I actually generally agree, and I want to thank you so much for allowing us to discuss this point, because the video, the introduction video, that was not the film, but the one before for our panel, it mentioned, well, what if it's Putinism without Putin afterwards, right? And sort of to the sense of your question, what if it's something equally bad? Again, I want to answer as a historian. Rewind back 200 years from now, early 19th century. If you look at these 200 years, you will find that with one significant, but also very unique in terms of circumstances. Exception, that's Stalin after Lenin. Every other time, there's been a change of leadership in Russia, even when it was just a dynastic change from father to son in the Russian Empire, and even when it was a change, like after Stalin to Khrushchev within the communist regime. Every single time, again, with one exception, Stalin after Lenin, the successor turned around the policy completely and built his entire political course on the repudiation of what was happening before. Every single time. This is our tradition. So it's impossible to have Putinism without Putin. This is very much a personalistic regime. This is not an ideological dictatorship like in China, for example, or in Cuba, where you can change leaders and the basis will stay the same. This is a regime that its own leaders call the vertical of power. That's their own term. And that vertical goes up to one single individual at the top. As soon as that individual, in one way or another, is removed from that top, everything will be different. Now, that is not to say that, whoever comes after Putin from within this regime will be Andrei Sakharov. Of course not. But it will be somebody, and I completely agree with what Gennady just said, it will be somebody who will be from the inside, but who will, from the first moment go, will start doing everything the opposite of what has been done under the current regime. Exactly, because they will need to do, look, this regime, we know the direction. It's been 25 years. This is the direction of this regime is political repression inside. No free elections, no independent media, no parliament, no judiciary, confrontation with the Western democratic world. Whoever comes after will start reversing this, and that will give a moment of opportunity, a window of opportunity, to all the genuinely democratic forces. There will be that period of transition. It will be very short, by definition. These windows of opportunity are brief, as they were in the early 90s, as they were in 1917, in 1905 to an extent. And this is why I keep hammering this point again, that we need to have that roadmap. We need to have that plan for the day after Putin, because when that day comes, it's going to be too late.
It's better if we have planned before the day after Putin.
I would enjoy the discussion and very briefly mention that I think that everybody is better than Putin. Everybody. And even chaos is better than Putin. I really think so.
Yeah, well, since my real job is following various developments with nuclear weapons, I would probably disagree about the chaos being better than Putin because there are some dangerous weapons around that need to be taken care of. But at the same time...
It's very dangerous to have a deranged madman, an old Soviet KGB officer in charge of those weapons, as the world is seeing now.
That's fair point. At the same time, I think just to add kind of a note of maybe not an optimism to this particular point, I think, and that may be the case with other areas as well. But if you look at, for example, you look at this whole kind of nuclear enterprise, nuclear complex, including the military units that actually serve weapons, that are managing them and all that, it's interesting to see that there are, these are fairly strong institutional structures, and they have a certain kind of strength that I hope would prevent kind of the worst from happening, even in the circumstances of a general chaos, which I would agree that it is actually a possibility. So now, do we have a yes, please?
When Prigozhin was so incredibly successful in his march to Moscow, what did that say? How weak or strong Putin is? Did part of the army actually sabotage? Did they let just Prigozhin move forward? It seemed to us unbelievable. And it seemed to us that actually Prigozhin stopped only because there was kind of a deal which ended probably in his death. But it seemed to us that he could have gone on. So how strong or weak is Putin? And the forces that made this possible, the question goes to Vladimir Kara-Murza, the forces in play at that time, what role do they have today?
Thank you so much for the question. I remember that day very well. It was a Saturday, the Prigozhin coup. I was in a cell with just one cellmate. There were two of us, so I was still in Moscow, in SIZO 5, the Vodnik prison. And my cellmate had this horrendous custom. He would always watch Vladimir Solovyov and the Russian TV propaganda every single day. I was telling my lawyers, if we hadn't been kicked out of the Council of Europe, I should have lodged a complaint under the article on torture, because it is every day listening to these guys. But he was. And so I wake up, and already the TV switched on, but it's something really weird on that TV. They're showing these tanks that are also with these armored vehicles outside of Moscow. They show Putin with a white face and with fear in his eyes, standing there, in his Kremlin office, pronouncing some really crazy words like treason, an insurrection. And obviously I didn't understand what it was, because they were not saying the whole thing. They were only giving their response of the state, of the regime to this insurrection. They weren't actually talking about the insurrection itself. But then even stranger things began happening. Suddenly, the director of the prison and the head of the security department came in, which is on Saturday. That's unprecedented. That's the weekend. There's nobody there. They came in. They looked pretty scared too. And they led me to some office, sat down, and said, we want to have a conversation. And just a day or two before, it was the usual prison. Convict Kara-Murza, go there, do this, do that. Suddenly they were really polite to me. They said, Vladimir Vladimirovich, how are you feeling? Is everything okay? How are you finding this conditions? I said, what's happening? Why are you asking this? And then they told me what happened. They told me about the Prigozhin coup, that these troops were now just 150 kilometers from Moscow, that they basically took over the city of Rostov-on-Don, and all the rest of it. I learned it from the prison authorities. And I had to really work hard to stop myself laughing, to looking at these guys and the fear in their face, because, well, this just proves the point that we started this conversation with. This is how things change in Russia. Who could have predicted that even the evening before? No one. And this is how it happens. And suddenly, all these prison directors are really polite because they don't know what's going to happen, who's going to take over. And they start asking me questions. Well, how is it possible? Prigozhin was Putin's ally for such a long time. How could he turn against him? And yeah, but this is how things happen. Not just in Russia, but in Russia too. And of course, as we know, that time, that insurrection did not succeed. And you're absolutely right to point out that, they stopped because they thought they had a deal with Putin. And that deal ended with Putin shooting down the plane that Prigozhin was flying, and all the leadership of the Wagner Group is dead. Which means one very important thing. Whoever next goes is not going to stop, because he's not going to trust Putin's word anymore.
The main point of this rebel, he had a personal army, and basically they all had weapons. And without that, no revolution is possible. I mean, he had resources to go and, to have this march. About Ukraine, I actually came here from Ukraine, and I spent there 2 months. Before the full-scale invasion, I was going to this country every year, and this time that was first time for me since 2022. And what I saw, I mean, I think it's unbelievable how this country is still keeping fight, and how all these people are keeping the kindness inside them. I mean, every person whom I met in Kiev, in Kharkiv, in Izum, in Odessa, where I've been, all these people seen death. All of them. I mean, people in the cafes, in the taxis, in the bars, everyone. And they all living under curfew. So I was thinking about Moscow. I mean, how long this city will, if there will be the conditions the same as in Ukraine, in Russia, how long people will survive in silence in these conditions. But yeah, that was just a side talk.
Okay.
On Alex's question, if I may briefly, I think frankly that, people from Putin's closest entourage hate him more than they hate us, because the whole raison d'etre for so many years was to steal in Russia and then stash away and spend that stolen money in the West. I mean, this is how these people operated. They had all their villas and the yachts and their, apartments and whatever in Western countries. That's where they sent their kids to school. That's where they send their wives and their mistresses on shopping trips. And that's something we've been fighting against for years and years through the Magnitsky Acts, as you know. And that was a very much an uphill struggle. We had some successes, quite a few. But once the full-scale invasion began, a lot of these sanctions started coming through beyond the Magnitsky mechanism, and because of the special, all these special legal regimes introduced because of the invasion. And suddenly these people lost everything. They lost their reason for living, really, because suddenly, they still have these villas and these apartments and these yachts, but they don't have access to them anymore. They can't go. Their bank accounts have been frozen. They're no longer able to enjoy, weekend trips to Paris and so on. And so there is this desire for, not out of any, benevolence or any good political views, but just for their own selfish purpose. There is a widespread desire, I believe, in the ruling establishment for normalization of everything, and that's really important. To me, that's why what Trump is doing now is so damaging, because he's sending signals that there can be normalization with Putin, whereas in fact they cannot be, and they should not be. They should never be, until this murderer remains in the Kremlin. But on this point, I have to say that even with a full-scale invasion, we see how inadequately these sanctions mechanisms are being implemented. Up until last year, the wife of the deputy Russian defense minister, called Timur Ivanov, was living in her apartment in Paris while the full-scale war in Ukraine was going on. Last year, 2024, Putin's grandniece, by the last name of Tsivireva, who is the daughter of his niece, also Anna Tsivireva, who is actually the deputy minister of defense herself as well, she was freely able to travel around countries of the European Union. How is that possible? Last autumn, the son of Vladimir Artikov, who is the number 2 person in Rostech, which is the government military corporation that provides all the armaments and military equipment for the war in Ukraine and for the Russian army in general, his son took his girlfriend out to a weekend trip to Milan to take her to La Scala while the war in Ukraine was going on. How is it possible? So there should be a strengthening of these types of sanctions. There should be a strengthening of the compliance mechanisms, of the way that these are implemented, because it's unacceptable that this is all happening. And while we're on sanctions, I think it's also very important not to fall into the other extreme, as unfortunately some countries on the eastern flank of the European Union have done, where they impose just blanket bans on everybody with a Russian passport from crossing the border, from getting a visa, from driving in a car. The Kremlin is loving this. I can vouch for that. When I was in prison, I had that radio on my cell, on my cell wall that was on every day. And every time another Eastern EU country introduced a measure like this, the Kremlin would be, they would just enjoy this. They say, we've been telling you, these Westerns are Russophobes. They don't hate us, the Putin regime. They hate all of you. They hate every single Russian. And that's frankly the signal that is sometimes sent by this. And this is totally unacceptable, because this is the 21st century. And we cannot be discriminating against people based on the color of their passport. And the only people this is helping is the Putin regime and its propaganda. So they should be no blanket sanctions that discriminates anybody, because, I don't think Sergei Lavrov was planning a drive in Estonia in his car. But you know what? Independent human rights lawyers and journalists and civil society activists, it really affects their work, because they cannot travel anymore, and they cannot do. Russians who are helping Ukrainians escape by cars from the war zones, they can't do it because they have Russian number plates, and the Baltic states won't let them in. How is that helping to restrict Putin's war effort? That's actually helping his propaganda. But there should be absolutely more strengthening and better implementation of these targeted sanctions, because to the point you are making, that makes a lot of people around Putin very, very unhappy.
Okay, thank you. So, yes.
My name is Henry. I'm with the Hertie School. The question is related to the future generation of Russia. One of the articles in New York Times have pointed out that the young people in Russia have a very high support when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. Some people would even call them a lost generation. In order to secure democracy, just by our generation, by the current generation's work, is far from enough. You need a civil society. You need a civic education. How? Or what are some of the measures that we can do to help the future generations, for help the future next generations of Russians to learn how to live in a civil society, to get out of this vicious circle?
First of all, let's please never again mention anything about support and opinion polls and who thinks what. It is meaningless, and frankly, I don't want to use any bad words. It is meaningless to talk about opinion polls and support and measuring support in a totalitarian state such as Russia. I'll just give you just one example. 3 months ago, a man in Moscow named Yuri Kakhovets received 5 years in prison for responding to an opinion poll question on the street saying that he's against the war in Ukraine. They identified him, they tracked him down, they arrested him, they sent him to prison for 5 years for giving a response to an opinion poll question. And then people talk about who supports what where. This is totally meaningless. Let's forget about this, because all this does is plays into the hands of Putin's propaganda. There is no way to judge the state of public opinion in a country where you're in prison for expressing your opinion. This is impossible. What we do have are glimpses, what I would call glimpses, from time to time, of how a lot of people in Russia actually do feel about what's going on. And since you talk specifically about the war, how a lot of people in Russia feel about the war. And one such glimpse came about a year ago, a little more now, in February of 2024, when, amid the staged circus of our so-called presidential election, where you had Putin and a couple of pre-approved clowns running alongside him, there was one candidate, a lawyer and former member of parliament named Boris Nadezhdin, who announced that he was going to run for president of Russia as the anti-war candidate. He said the war in Ukraine is a tragic mistake, and he's going to end it on day one. And the public response was unbelievable. Suddenly, all over the country, in large cities and small towns, you saw these hours-long lines of people, mostly young people, to your question, who were waiting at his campaign offices to sign the ballot petitions to get him registered as a candidate, because you need to get 200,000 signatures. He had no money, he had no media access, he had no administrative resources. He collected 200,000 signatures in 10 days. Because people, as soon as people saw even one small opportunity to express that they're against this war, because you're still not imprisoned in Russia for, officially supporting a ballot petition for a candidate. That's still legal. And people jumped on that opportunity. And of course, needless to say, he was not allowed on the ballot, because opposition candidates in today's Russian elections never are. But that was almost besides the point, because suddenly this carefully constructed image, carefully constructed by Putin's propaganda, that everybody, as Masha was saying, that everybody apparently supports this regime, supports the war. This is fake. This is not real. This is not true. And, you can rig election results, which they do. You can fix these opinion poll numbers, which they do, and some people still believe in them, but they're nothing to do with reality. There's nothing you can do to hide the images of hundreds of thousands of people standing for hours in a long Russian winter to sign the ballot petitions for an anti-war candidate. I remember my lawyer, on his weekly visits to see me in prison, he would bring me the photos he would print out from social media like Twitter and Facebook, and these images of these long lines. This was amazing to see. And there was one young woman who wrote me from the town of Novorossiysk. It's in the south of Russia on the Black Sea coast in the southwest. And she was describing how she waited for 3.5 hours, I think it was, in that long line of people to sign the ballot petition for Nadezhdin. And then she ended the letter by saying, I never realized how many of us there are. And this is important. And those are the glimpses that we can see. Reality checks. And to the second part of your question, what should be done? Well, basically the exact opposite of what, for example, the United States of America is now doing. By shutting down all the broadcasting, by shutting down all the democracy assistance and all the work for civil society. One of the key factors, in my view, in the collapse of the Soviet regime was the fact that it had become delegitimized in the eyes of a significant part of its own population. Because at the end of the day, the regime fell when hundreds of thousands of people went on the streets in August 1991. And there were internal reports in the KGB that were declassified in the early 90s, but had been produced in the 70s and 80s, showing that, according to KGB estimates, up to 15%, 1/5, of the adult population of the Soviet Union, that's 30 million people, mostly in big cities, even the proportion was even higher, were daily listeners of these foreign radio broadcasts in the Russian language, like Radio Liberty, like the BBC Russian service, Deutsche Welle, and others. And it was these teenagers of the late 70s who listened to these broadcasts who were the 30-somethings who went to the barricades at the Moscow White House in August 1991, and the Soviet regime fell. And so one of the key things to me is reaching people inside Russia, including the young people, because of course they're more savvy in all the technological stuff. Of course, everything in Russia is blocked. There is a severe internet censorship. But, if you're savvy enough, you can go around with VPNs and so on. And so this is what the free world should be doing, trying to reach people with information inside Russia. We see the U.S. government doing exactly the opposite by canceling and shutting down all these broadcasts. We're also seeing U.S. big tech companies doing the opposite and actually helping Putin censor information instead of helping Russian citizens get it. One recent example was, we had an op-ed about this a couple of months ago in the Washington Post with Yulia Navalny and Ilya Yashin and me, three of us. And it was about the fact that Apple, the Apple Corporation in California, USA, at the request of Putin's government, took down more than 50 VPN services from its Russian App Store. Those services allow people to go around the censorship and reach independent news websites. And they took down the apps belonging to major independent media companies like the BBC, like Medusa, like Radio Free Europe, which was a US-funded broadcast. They took them down because Putin asked them to. So, in fact, we very often see Western governments and Western companies acting as accomplices to the Putin regime and helping it hide information from our own people, and that is unacceptable.
Okay. Before I go to the questions, let me put Luba on the spot because I know that I follow one of your social media accounts, and I know that you're a student of the life of the Russian elite. And if I remember correctly, you just recently commented, you said something about the kind of feedback that you're getting from Russia, from kind of Russian users who kind of are watching your videos. And in general, I think following up to what Vladimir just said, we do have a very large fairly large number of media, Russian language media, run by the Russians, not by the U.S. government. So, if you could say briefly, what's your sense? Are these efforts actually reaching the audience in Russia? And do you feel that there is some kind of a conversation there and feedback from people who are watching you? Thanks.
Yes, I run my own YouTube channel right now, and I have millions of viewers from Russia. I'm working for Russian audience. 70% of my audience is from Russia. And so, we are in immigration now. I was forced to leave Russia in 2021, but I have still a lot of supporters in Russia, and I can talk with them through online, through social medias. And I like to communicate with them and to receive feedbacks. And for example, I'm always very curious about what's going on in Moscow and in regions, what people are thinking about the war in Ukraine, about prices in grocery stores, and other things. And it's difficult right now to be in immigration and to be in touch with reality in Russia. So if you are living in Russia, you can go to the grocery store and just see what is going on, like with prices. But if you are living abroad, you should be you should be curious. You should try to make some efforts to get this information. So I like to talk with my supporters in Russia just to understand what is going on right now. Not and a lot of things have changed since I left my country. Yeah.
Thank you. So another question here.
So naturally, Russia's standing and geopolitical power has also strengthened a lot of the authoritarian regimes around it, including Iran. So my question for the panel was, how can we think about Russia after Putin also beyond Russia? What could that really mean for these, not only regionally, as Masha said, but also more geopolitically for authoritarian regimes around it that take so much strength from Putin and power from Putin? Thank you.
You said you're from Iran. Okay. Yeah. If we continue this prison talk, I remember the first months of the full-scale invasion. I was basically in jail in the detention center, so I was not allowed to read any independent news. I had only a propaganda radio station, and all our cell was full of political activists who went to the single demonstrations against the war. And we wanted to know every minute what is going on. So we were listening this propaganda like every hour, all the updates. And somehow they put so-called advertisement before the news. And it sounded like Russia, Iranian scenario. And then they were talking about Iran and how Iran was living under the sanctions for so many years. So they were basically like preparing themselves and the audience to the conditions. So I'm super agree. I should say I super agree that it's not possible to count any independent opinion statistics in the conditions of war censorship. Because again, in Russia now, it's illegal to say even that the war is going on and to call the war. It's criminal. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the countries which been, as they call, occupied by Soviet Union, like Baltic countries, for example, that was quite easy for them to identify themselves, articulate themselves through the national idea. And there were just very small gap of 10 years between the collapse of Soviet Union and the moment when Putin first time took the presidency. So that was just a little bit more than 10 years to articulate what Russia is and who Russians basically are. And I'm pretty sure that a majority of Russians, they even did not have enough time to articulate what it is, because a lot of people identify themselves as the Soviet citizens, and then suddenly they are Russians, and what it is, and what does it mean. And there were a lot of amazing people, and still are, who were reflecting about the history, about the terror which Soviet Union state was doing against their own people. But again, 10 years is a very small gap. And then Putin took the power and started to shut down first media, then oligarchs, then independent journalists, etc. So for my opinion, it's super important to save the independency of those countries who got it, right? Because again, Putin wants to somehow to rebuild this, actually the dead body of this empire. And it's proved. I mean, when he just became president, in one of the first interviews, one of the journalists asked him what is the worst thing which happens with Russia, and he said the collapse of Soviet Union. So he really missed it. But I super agree that it's personal dictatorship. It's not China. There are no millions and millions of people who truly believe with all their hearts on Putin and his state. Everyone understands that there are thieves and murderers there. People just simply afraid. And for many years, they've been told that they are no one, they do not have voice, that even if they will go to protest, they will lose everything and lose their life. So they are small. And yeah. So for my opinion, it's important to save those who got this independency and got this voice, save with all the resources which Europe for now have. And just, I mean, open the eyes and understand that, I mean, they the countries could be potentially attacked with armies. I mean, it should be a budget put to the to the military to protect, because how many days, for example, Lithuania or Estonia will how to say it will survive if Russian army will come? 3 days or like how many days? And if Putin will take the Ukraine, I mean the central part of Ukraine, and occupied the eastern parts of Ukraine, he will mobilize these Ukrainians and force them to fight with Europe.
Okay. 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 So
could I very quickly just to that question? I mentioned that there wasn't really full transparency anywhere close to it in the 1990s. There was one brief episode, the Constitutional Court in 1992, the Constitutional Court hearing. Vladimir Bukovsky, whom I mentioned, got very short-timed and very partial access to the former Soviet Communist Party Central Committee archive. And the documents he got his hands on, he made sure to publish. So now if you Google Bukovsky archive, you'll see a big collection of documents, including translated into English, about many things to do with what the Soviet leadership did, but including all the support that it gave to client regimes around the world, to their supporters and forces around the world, from Palestinian terrorists to the striking miners in Britain against Margaret Thatcher's government, to half of African countries who basically run from the Kremlin and so on. And so you saw really this web, this sort of dictatorial international ran from Moscow, with a lot of money put into it, with a lot of other kind of resources, of course on a different scale, but in essence, Putin is doing exactly the same. We clearly see that there's this dictators international. Some of it we even see and even know now. Talking about Prigozhin, last year in July when Maduro lost the presidential election in Venezuela to Edmundo Gonzalez, lost massively, and there were mass protests in Venezuela, they were being squashed by the Wagner Group, which is Prigozhin's Russian paramilitaries. The same group runs basically 7 or 8 countries in Africa, including Madagascar and the Central African Republic. As you know, Putin's regime was great friends with the Islamic regime in Tehran. They visit each other, they call each other, they try to sort of develop their cooperation and so on. And I think in answer to your question, once the Putin regime goes from power, a lot of countries will be able to breathe more freely, not just in the region, obviously that goes without saying, like Moldova and Georgia, and of course Ukraine and Belarus, but also countries as far as Latin America, Asia, Southeast Asia, because when next time we have a full opening of the archive, I think we'll see a lot of interesting stuff in there, including about all the support Kremlin is giving to all these client regimes around the world, including Iran.
Okay, Mariana?
I actually wanted to come back to the question about the young people and Russia after Putin. I wanted to reiterate the position of Vladimir. Actually, I worked with your father for the independent, first independent, NTV, independent television, and Russian Channel 1 during Yeltsin's times. I was a reporter. So the big challenge for the young people is that they have not seen that transition from democracy, from authoritarian state to the democracy like my generation have seen. I've seen it happen and I've been there. So I know it is possible, but young people today might not be able to see it. So that's a challenge, and that's a challenge that Lyubov is dealing with. For example, I've seen her and I filmed her conducting polls, anonymous from America. She would call and it would be anonymous and ask people what they thought about Putin's elections, who they would vote for. Would they vote for Nadezhdin? Nadezhda means hope in Russia, by the way. And so, and the only people who responded or picked up the phones were Putinists, because everybody else was afraid. So this is how, you cannot really rely on polls. And I do want to reiterate your position that I think that Russian history is cyclical and that Putin has selected his Politburo, and there is nobody there who is charismatic enough as Putin. So from all I read, and that's in Guriev's book, Spin Dictators, there will be no Putinism after Putin, but that's from my research, because I'm the only person on that panel who haven't been poisoned. Lyubov's husband was poisoned by Prigozhin's people, or imprisoned, or tortured.
Okay. So before I go to the round questions, I want to add a bit to this discussion of kind of other countries, and maybe kind of to add a little bit of kind of a silver lining in a way that we should also keep in mind that there is a reservoir of goodwill toward Russia as a country. In many places, you look at India, for example. Look at I don't know Iran, but of course you could say that the relationship is what it is because of the regimes are similar in many ways. But at the same time, in other places, you could have this kind of a tale. Maybe that's the Soviet tale of certain kind of progressive policies or other things. So and that actually, and again, if you look at some, I know bits, for example, with the Iranian nuclear program again. Russia can play and has played a positive, a constructive role in in quite a few cases, and it is possible. So there is this kind of there is the capacity there in Russian institutions that could play could be constructive and could be responsible actors in world affairs. And I think it is important to see that these institutions, these people, they do exist, and they are separate from the current Russian leadership. And to the large extent, the challenge is to preserve the healthy elements of the Russian government and Russian society, and at the same time transform the country in other ways. So I would suggest I have a list of questions. So I would suggest taking like 3 in a row, and we had the person with the camera. Well, he had a question, but now it's you, sir. It's you.
I forgot to mention before that with the World Forum and Cinema for Peace, we're very happy to support your film, Lyubov Sobol. We're looking forward to see the new version or the next.
I forgot to mention how grateful we are because the story was independent. You know, we started this film independently from the foundation, and I was introduced to Lyuba by Michael McFaul, who was the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Russia, and my partner Paul Gregory, and we just started. And Lyuba said, if it takes 2 hours of my time, then sure. So 2.5 years later, we'll have a full film that basically talks about the path of an oppositioner, and a woman oppositioner, and a young woman who will definitely outlive Putin.
What do you say when people have these two different opinions? One opinion is, let's have a freeze with Putin on Ukraine as quick as possible, because Ukraine is not strong enough anymore to protect itself, and we have the danger that maybe we could lose all of Ukraine. Versus the theory, and obviously with concessions, the way Putin likes it, that we have lost Donbass and Crimea. Versus the version, no, let's keep going on, and let's try to give Ukraine from Europe more support. As long as Putin is actually occupied Ukraine, he cannot attack other countries. He's going to get weaker. His economy is hurting, and maybe he might break down. If you hear these two different contradicting opinions, what is your opinion?
Okay, don't answer yet. Let's collect. You had a question?
In Finland, where we have a very long border with Russia, there's growing national anxiety. And I wanted to know your opinion about how worried we should be in Finland. So there's a lot of talk about Georgia, Baltic countries, but what about countries like Finland?
Okay, and that would be the final.
For some reason, Putin would pass away in the next couple of years, and we would have a new Russian leader who doesn't completely distance himself from Putin, but does appear a lot more moderate. How should the West react? Should they welcome that? Should they reward that, or should they maintain the type of attitude they have now? I mean, a type of boycott.
Okay, thank you. And now I will start with Vladimir, but take this as an opportunity to say the closing words, and I will go through everyone just with, if you want to answer questions, feel free to do so, but if you want just to say something in conclusion, feel free to do so. Okay.
I'll answer the questions. I think these are actually important themes to end our conversation on. Ukrainians are losing people every single day, civilians, children being bombed. I think that the quicker this stops, the better. That's the only response I can give as a human being. But it's very important to have real security guarantees for Ukraine. And we must understand, for as long as Putin is in power, he's always going to be a threat. There's going to be a possibility of a new war. So the best we can hope now, which was the outline of your question, is some kind of a temporary ceasefire. And it's very important that this temporary ceasefire includes some real, or as real as they can be, guarantees that Putin does not attack again in a week or in a month. And of all the ideas that I've heard voiced so far, I think that the most realistic and the most effective one is to have peacekeepers from countries like Britain and France and several Poland countries that already offered to send their military there as this sort of, well, a tripwire, for the lack of a better term, that Putin will know if he does attack again, he's going to be attacking not just Ukraine but all these countries together. Even if NATO's Article 5 provision is not formally enabled, everybody will still understand it. And this is very, very important. Any ceasefire deal, any post-war settlement, whatever we want to call it, to my mind, has to include a provision on the release of all the captives of this war. We cannot bring back the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost because of Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine over these last 3 years, in fact, over these last 11 years, right? But there are tens of thousands of people who remain in captivity because of this war. Obviously, POWs from both sides, but that's sort of a given because that's in the Third Geneva Convention, so they have to be repatriated. But I'm also talking about Ukrainian civilian hostages. That's a category that's not provided by any piece of international humanitarian law. It's a completely illegal notion, but that's what's been happening. Russian forces have been abducting civilians and putting them in detention camps and detention centers and prisons, and there are thousands of them. We don't even know how many. All these people have to be released and returned home. Abducted Ukrainian kids, by some estimates up to 20,000 who have been abducted by Russian forces in these 3 years and kept on Russian proper or Russian controlled territory. These kids need to be returned home. And very importantly, Russian political prisoners who are jailed because of their opposition to the war. That's the fastest growing category on the Russian political prisoner list. They have to be released. There has to be some kind of an amnesty provision. Because for many of these people, it's not only a question of unjust and unlawful imprisonment, it's actually a question of life or death. People are not going to survive if something like this doesn't happen. So I'm very grateful that some very prominent human rights NGOs, importantly together from Ukraine and from Russia, like the Center for Civil Liberties, led by Alexander Matviichuk, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and Memorial from Russia, also a Nobel Peace Prize winner in the same year, led by Oleg Orlov, who was my fellow passenger on a plane. He was also a political prisoner who was exchanged in our exchange. They launched this international campaign called People First, where they call on Western governments who will be negotiating the ceasefire to include that provision, to make sure that the people who still can be saved are saved by this ceasefire. To me, that's the most important priority, so I would obviously prefer that option, answering to your question. And that People First provision has to be in any deal that is made, because there's too much talk about territory and assets and the raw earth minerals and whatever else. There's not enough talk about people who actually can still be saved, and so they have to. To your question, Anna, I was in Finland in September, met with President Stubb, with the Prime Minister, with the Foreign Minister. We had a wide-ranging discussion on the very topic that you're asking, and I was really actually happy to hear from all of them this understanding that the best long-term guarantee, even though Finland is in NATO now, thanks to Mr. Putin as well, but the long-term guarantee of security and peace for Finland is a democratic neighbor. It's a democratic Russia. Nobody understands it better than our neighbors, like your country, because for you it's a very immediate question. And so I was very happy to hear them, all of the senior officials I met in Helsinki, talk about this long-term strategy. That yes, for now there are all these measures we're taking, but we realize, especially Finland with its history, what happened in 1939, 1940, they realized that the only real guarantee of security and peace is a normal democratic neighbor to the east, as opposed to this repressive and belligerent regime. And so I think your country is more than anybody should be interested in that and should have a roadmap in place for that day. And I was happy to hear those sounds when I was in Helsinki. And to your question about successive, first of all, you started your question by saying if Mr. Putin passes away in a couple of years, I really hope he has a long and healthy life, because I want that man to sit in prison for everything he's done. I want to see his face when he sits in the same dock where Milosevic sat, where Rodrigo Duterte, the Filipino dictator, is going to be sitting in the next few weeks. I want him to sit there too. Because I'm a Christian, I know there will be a trial up there in any case, but I also want him to have one here. I want all the people who lost their loved ones in Ukraine, the family of Boris Nemtsov, the family of Alexei Navalny, the family of all the people killed by this criminal regime. I want them to see his face when he sits on trial. So I hope it's not as easy for him as what you suggested. But to the substance of your question, that's the whole, I think that's the sort of the core of our conversation today. There needs to be a roadmap for the day after Putin. And what Gennady and I were talking about is that whoever comes after, there will be a change in policy. That's how it always happened in Russia over 200 years. And doesn't mean that that policy itself will be great. It only means that there will be a window of opportunity to seize and to make sure that this time we use that window of opportunity correctly and we don't make the mistakes that were made by Yeltsin's people and by Yeltsin's Western interlocutors in the 1990s. And so that roadmap for domestic change, the illustrations, the public reflection of all the crimes, the accountability, the transparency, this is up to us, but it's up to the West to make sure that they stand ready to help and assist that nascent democratic Russia during that short transition window in its democratic reforms, but also in the integration to Euro-Atlantic community, because again, it's in the interest of everybody. It's in the interest of everybody. The only way we're ever going to have a Europe whole, free, and at peace is with a democratic Russia as a part of it. And that's the goal that we should all have in front of us, and that's the goal that we should all be working towards together. Thank you so much for the questions.
Thank you. So we have literally a few minutes for brief remarks. If you want to, feel free to address any of the questions. And let's move around the room. And Luba, you are the next because of the way it is set up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm totally agree with Vladimir Kara-Murza, and I just want to mention that I believe in post-Putin Russia. I believe that democracy could happen in Russia, and we should fight for it, and it's worth to fight for it. And Alexei Navalny believed in Russian people and in Russia, so that's why he returned to Russia 4 years ago. So thank you for this conversation. I think that it's really important to to support the idea that after Putin's Russia, it's not a dream and it could be a reality. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Mariana?
There's this noise, but I hope people can hear me. To sort of reiterate both of your positions, I wanted to tell a short story. There is always when you're I wanted to tell a short story because always when you're filming, there is behind the scenes. And when I was at Stanford at Hoover Institution, we were introduced to Peter Robinson, who used to write Reagan's speeches. He was the one who wrote, when he was 20 years old, he wrote the speech, "Mr. President, tear down this wall." So he obviously knows how to put something concisely. So he said to Luba, he said that Russian history is indeed cyclical, and as he is observing its history in the past 150 years, the democratic Russia exists in parallel to the authoritarian Russia, and sometimes they come closer together and then recede, and closer together and then recede. We've seen that during Khrushchev's thaw, and we've seen that during the 90s, and he says that while authoritarian regime claims that they are the Russian history, the democratic opposition is as much part of history, and they might be right, but they might be part of history. But he said to her and to him that, but you are too. And I think it's important to know.
I think it's important for Europe to protect itself first, to understand that it's really, in danger. Yes, remember 2014 when Crimea been annexed and there was no proper answer from the West that this is wrong to take the territory of other country. There were no proper sanctions, no proper personal sanctions, no embargo to Russian resources, etc. So they continued the war in the east, and then after some preparation, they did the full-scale invasion. For example, now they will freeze the conflict. There is now a talk about 30 days, etc. But it's not possible to have a deal with Putin. He will fuck you up. He's and especially with a Trump government, continuing to the question of Finland, imagine the situation that NATO will not protect you. No NATO. With the NATO forces protecting you. It should be first an understanding that this situation potentially could be real, that this is not an illusion or something like this. And yes, this discussion about the ceasefire does not include, it's more than 10,000 people are kept in the hidden concentration camps inside Russia. So basically without investigation, without court investigation, without any even sign that these people exist as a prisoners, they are kept in the penal colonies, in the pre-trial detention centers, which were cleaned, from other prisoners who were there before, just to keep these people from the occupied territories there. They are tortured, they commit suicide. There are horrible stories, unbelievably horrible stories of rape, of tortures, just read them. They are real. It's like what is going on now, and it's completely hidden. And these people are even not a point of the discussion about this permanent peace, as well as children who've been kidnapped. Their names been changed. Their parents are looking for them. And organizations who were researching, who were doing the research about these children has no money to continue what they are doing, because amazing new power of United States just took that.
Okay. Well, I think we all wish we could have ended on a more positive note, but that's the reality we are in, and I
Sorry.
think that's life, and I think that everybody eventually, I think, agreed that the best way to look forward is to look and work toward a democratic Russia, and that way we will hopefully address most, if not all, the issues that we have today. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to the panelists.